Hello and welcome to this online lesson. I am Mr. Hoven, and today we'll be starting our next unit, the Civil War. And we're going to begin by talking about just kind of reviewing slavery, then we're looking at the abolitionists and the Underground Railroad. So let's get started. But before looking at slavery itself, let's look at the industry, or actually the economy of the South. Now, cotton was king. Farming was huge in the South. There was very little manufacturing. And in 1793, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. This was a machine that could remove seeds from cotton fibers. Basically, it processed cotton fibers at a rapid rate. This allowed farmers to grow more cotton and increase their profits. This put a huge emphasis on slave labor to grow and harvest more cotton for a higher profit. So the introduction of this cotton gin had several consequences. The biggest one was it led to the need for more and more slaves working longer and longer hours because farmers wanted to produce more cotton. And on these cotton farms or plantations, the very large farms where cotton or tobacco was produced, that's where the slaves were. They usually worked under an overseer in the field, someone who kept an eye on them, and often these individuals could be very brutal to the slaves. Enslaved African Americans suffered hardship and misery during their enslavement. They worked hard, earned no money, and had little hope of freedom. One of their worst fears was being sold to another planter, basically separating the families, breaking them up, and selling one or two members of the family in order for the farmer to make a profit. However, in the face of these brutal conditions, they had to cope with their situation. They maintained their family life as best they could and developed a culture of their own, blending African American elements and white American elements into their culture. They resisted slavery through a variety of clever methods, and they continued to look ahead for the day that they would one day be set free. Now, between 1830 and 1860, life on the plantations and under slavery became even more difficult. The slave codes were laws that southern states had passed to control enslaved people. They became more severe. One purpose of the codes was to prevent the event that white Southerners dreaded the most, the slave rebellion. For this reason, slave codes prohibited enslaved people from assembling in large groups. The codes also required enslaved people to have written passes before leaving the slaveholder's property. So if they wanted to leave for a period of time, they needed to have a written pass. Slave codes made it a crime to teach enslaved individuals to read or to write. White Southerners feared that an education would allow the slaves to start revolting because they would have the ability to gain more knowledge and information. An enslaved person who could not read or write, whites believed, was less likely to rebel. Now, some enslaved African Americans did rebel openly against their owners. One was Nat Turner. He was a popular religious leader among enslaved people. He had taught himself to read and write, and in 1831 he led a group of followers on a brief or short violent rampage in Southampton County, Virginia. Before being captured, Turner and his followers killed at least 55 whites. He was hanged, but his rebellion frightened white Southerners, and it led to the increased enforcement of slave codes. And slaves were always on the search for freedom. They're always looking for that possibility, that light of hope that would get them to a better place and a better life. Now, the Underground Railroad was a means for slaves to escape. This was a network of safe houses owned by free blacks and whites who opposed slavery. This gave escaped slaves refuge on their journey, hopefully to the north or west, and it helped slaves escape to freedom. And as you can see on the map here, these safe houses spanned all over the northeastern part of the United States, as well as the South. There are even houses in this area of Palmyra that still have hidden passageways or hideaways where slaves or enslaved people who were trying to move north would be able to hide out for a night or two before moving on. Now, working the Underground Railroad were people known as abolitionists, and these were people who opposed slavery and wanted to end it as fast as they could. One of these individuals was Frederick Douglass, and you've probably heard about him before. He was born into slavery. He grew up a slave, but he was able to escape and become free in 1838. He was well noted as a speaker who spoke out against the institution of slavery, and he published the North Star, which was a newspaper out of Rochester, New York, which was a abolitionist newspaper which spoke the evils of slavery. Another abolitionist was the angry abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. He was the editor of the Liberator, an abolitionist newspaper. He called for emancipation of all slaves, and he was a very radical abolitionist. Now, not everyone, even though people were against slavery, they did not all believe in emancipation and making slaves citizens as whites were. A lot of people opposed that idea, even if they didn't like slavery. So they saw William Lloyd Garrison as being very radical, and which caused some people to maybe think differently about the slavery issue. Another abolitionist was Sojourner Truth. She was another individual born into slavery who escaped to New York. She was self-educated, taught herself how to read and write. She spoke to the audiences in great theaters about the horrors of slavery. She also supported suffrage, or voting rights for women, and this was something that was becoming more and more common at this time. Many women sought to gain the right to vote. The final abolitionist that we are going to talk about is Harriet Tubman. She again was an escaped slave, and it was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. She made 19 trips into the Deep South by 1860 and escorted over 300 slaves to freedom. So she not only got her freedom, she went back and got some more. She went back and helped people, putting herself in great danger. There was a huge bounty on her head because so many people were looking for her, not only because she was an escaped slave, but she was helping other slaves escape. And she was very good at finding ways to disguise herself in the South when she was moving other slaves north. And to wrap things up, I just wanted to talk quickly about a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. This was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and it told readers about the horrors of slavery. And this was a book that changed a lot of people's minds about the institution of slavery and the implications it had on individuals. So just to wrap things up, we talked about the industry, the idea that cotton was king. Today, we've also talked about life under slavery, slave codes. Also mentioned people like Nat Turner and his rebellion, the Underground Railroad, and several abolitionists. I hope you've enjoyed this online video. Next time we'll get into talking about a little bit more slavery and into the tensions rising between the North and the South. We'll see you next time.